Today we'll be working on making some iron gall ink. The information I'll be presenting comes from research done by Marie Flamet from the Yale University Library back in March 2013. I'll also be using the recipe of a manuscript from the year 1431 as my group is representing middle 15th century history. It seemed most appropriate to take and use a recipe from that time period as opposed to the ones that were written later in the 16th and 17th centuries. Iron gall ink is one of the most frequently found inks in manuscripts from the Middle Ages up to the 19th century. Historically, iron gall ink was homemade up until about the 18th century when it was mass-produced on a commercial production level. Iron gall ink itself is comprised of four main ingredients. It's the tannins, a source of iron, a solvent, and a binder. In the recipe that we'll be using, the source of tannins will be gall nuts taken from an oak tree. The source of iron will be iron sulfate. The solvent will be red wine, and the binder will be gum arabic. Gall nuts are spherical growths found on oak trees. Their development is triggered when an insect punctures the tree branches and the twigs where they deposit their eggs. When the larvae hatch, they feed on the tree and secrete an irritant. Galls are the plant's defense mechanism for that irritant. As they grow, they provide shelter and food for the larvae until they reach maturity and are able to chew their way out. This is a gall. This one I found while at a festival back in October. Some other ones I found that I'll be using this recipe I found while out on a Spartan race up in Tejon Ranch, Central California. You can tell by the holes that this is where the larva chewed its way out. It's these secretions that the larva made that are part of the tannins that this gall contains and we'll be trying to leach out using the wine. These are actually quite light and soft. The ones that I found during the Spartan race I had put into my water bag in a pouch to try and bring home, and they broke quite easily actually when I was transporting them home. So I'm not entirely sure when the season is for a wasp to sting an oak and therefore produce these galls. I found these in October, which I'm going to assume is late in the season, which is probably why I didn't find very many of them. I have found these on Amazon, go figure, as well as the other ingredients that I was looking for, but I do have to admit that finding oak galls online was not what I was expecting. As part of the recipe, I'm going to read the recipe from the manuscript. The manuscript was written by Jehan Lebeg, which I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, back in the year 1431. And it reads as follows. To make good ink for writing, particularly for books, take 4 bottles of good wine, white or red, and 1 pound of galls, slightly bruised, which must be put into the wine and allowed to stand for 12 days, and be stirred every day with a stick. The 12th day it must be strained through a strainer of fine linen and must be poured into a clean jar, and put on the fire to get hot until almost boils. Then remove from the fire, and when it has cooled so as to only be tepid, put into it 4 ounces of gum arabic, which must be very bright and clear, and stir it with a stick. Then add ½ pound Roman vitriol and stir it continually with a stick until all the things are well incorporated together, and let it cool and keep for use. And note that ink made with wine is good for writing books upon the sciences, because when books are written with it, the letters do not fade and can hardly be scraped out or discharged from parchment or paper. But if they are written with ink made with water, it is not so, for they can easily be scraped out, and it may happen that the letters written with it will fade. So the recipe itself goes as 4 bottles of wine or water, 1 pound of galls, 4 ounces of gum arabic, and 6 ounces of vitriol. And if you took equal parts of each, galls, gum, and vitriol, as much of one as the other by weight, it would still be good. As for instance, 6 ounces of each would be sufficient for the said 4 pounds of wine or water, or wine and water mixed as before. I mentioned earlier in the video that we'll be using iron sulfate as the source of iron for this ink, whereas the manuscript specifically calls for Roman vitriol. Those two are actually the same thing. Iron sulfate or a ferrous sulfate is a metal salt that has been historically used for textile and leather dyeing. In literature and historical ink recipes, it is often referred to as vitriol, green vitriol, copperas, green copperas, and Roman vitriol. Gum arabic is a natural water-soluble gum that exudes from the acacia trees, generally found in Africa, India, and Australia. It has been used for hundreds of years as a binder in inks and paints, as well as a varnish for watercolors. It can be found as transparent lumps, ranging in color from a pale yellow to dark orange, almost brown color. The lighter and clearer gum was generally favored, especially for painting. Once ground into a powder, it has an off-white color. Gum arabic serves many purposes in an ink. It makes the ink more viscous, improving its flow from the pen. It keeps insoluble pigment particles in suspension and helps bind the ink to the writing surface, and it gives the ink more brilliance and depth. So for the first part of this recipe, we need to essentially ferment the galls and leach the tannins out with the wine. Now, I have no intention of making 4 gallons of ink, so we'll be reducing the ratios of this recipe quite a bit for our purposes. First thing we need to do is have a container for the galls to soak in. And the next thing we need to do is we need to break up the galls and place them in the container for the wine to soak into. Now, understanding that later on in the process, we will be boiling or almost boiling this mixture. The assumption will be that it's for getting some of the moisture out of this. I'm going to take and scrape the rest of these galls into. There we go. Now I'm going to add enough red wine to cover, or basically allow this to soak. There we go. And now we will allow this to soak for 12 days. And we'll be checking back regularly in order to do this. Now we've got the galls soaking in the wine. Get that nice and mixed in. And as the recipe calls for it, we will we'll be stirring it on a daily basis. Okay, so here we are 14 days later. The mixture has been sitting in the red wine, stirred up with a stick. It's fermented all of this time. And now, according to the instructions, we are now to strain it through a strainer of fine linen and be poured into a clean jar. So we will make some jar here. Start to strain it through and see what we get. So here's the liquid now. 8 ounces of liquid from the gall nut red wine mixture. You can see that the red wine has now turned into a brownish color. And now, according to the recipe, we need to heat this up to almost boiling and then stop. Now, because I have more fluid than the mason jar can hold, I'm actually going to transfer it to a saucepan instead of trying to heat it up in the jar itself. So now our mixture is heated up, and we will now cool it until near tepid before we finish our process. Okay, so now our mixture has cooled to a lukewarm temperature, and now, based on the recipe, we will be adding the final components to complete this. To start, we will be adding gum arabic. Gum arabic is a water-soluble product. It's used for many things, food, oils. It's a binding agent. Its purpose is to act as like a thickener. So we will be adding that into our, I've already been ground up because it comes in a crystallized form. So I grounded it up in order to make it dissolve better. I apologize for not doing this in a glass jar. As I mentioned before, I just don't have enough. I don't have a large enough one to really make this work. So get that stirred in. I'm actually gonna dissolve some of this out. There we go. Stir it with a stick. Finally, we will add what the recipe calls Roman vitriol, which is actually iron sulfate. Now, ferrous sulfate, iron sulfate plus acidic tannins, which are coming from the oak galls, creates a ferric tannate. It also has a byproduct of sulfuric acid. So when you measure this out for the recipe, you have to be sure not to use too much. Sulfuric acid is quite obviously a corrosive, and in lighter doses, it is what helps the It's what helps the ink get its color. It also what helps it from fading over time, which is why the manuscripts have survived for so long. However, there is the problem of when there is too much iron sulfate added to it, then obviously there are too much concentrations of sulfuric acid, and therefore it corrodes and eats away the paper, especially where the lines are thickest or has the most ink to it. This can, in modern times, can be counteracted with some sort of base liquid. But since we're doing such small amounts here, I am not going to be doing that. So, this out of the way. And then here it is. It comes in a powder form. And now, and then you keep stirring until it is all fully incorporated. Now, you actually can't see it right now because of it being in the saucepan, but the ink just went from the brownish, the reddish brown color that you saw to an actual black, or a brownish black. So I'll continue to mix this up until everything is properly incorporated into the liquid. And that should do it. So there you have it. Nice jar of medieval iron gall ink. And I have to say, it actually came out pretty good. So with that, I want to thank once again Bev Polf and Katrina Wood for their help with the research on this. And thank you all for watching.